Hi everyone. If you think you're at a low point in your life, this video is for you. My hope with this video is that if you're at a relatively minor low point in your life or approaching the depths, the insights and exploration that we will do in this video will help you in finding a direction and in overcoming these challenges. We're going to do this through one of Dazai's short stories, 8 Views of Tokyo, and we're going to use Dazai's life as an example and exploration in how he eventually overcomes and finds solutions to the challenges that he faces in his life. So in one of the early views in the short story, I think it was Gotanda is how Dazai refers to it. Dazai refers to this period of his life while he's still young as his moron period. Dazai basically says he was a fool, and I quote here, "I was a fool. I did nothing." He referred to himself as the idle nihilist. That was me in my first house in Tokyo. So Dazai really paints a kind of decrepit picture of himself here, very inactive, not doing anything in terms of any goals or progress. And in one of the, just continuing from this, in one of the few instances that he does venture out to form some activity at the university and attends a lecture in which usually he's skipping, he doesn't attend any lectures. Because he's saying that he's idle, he doesn't really do anything. But in one of the few instances that he does go to the university to go to a lecture, in the front lawn he meets a friend or an acquaintance from the university, and he actually discovers some quite unpleasant news about his wife, and then there's some further background to this, but Dazai's wife used to be a former geisha, and basically she runs away and escapes to be with him in Tokyo, and he kind of always referred to her as his like treasure, and he had this like, in his mind, he like saved her, and he had this very like idealistic view of her, but he learned some very unpleasant things about her, and then he questions her when he gets home, and at first she doesn't really say anything, but eventually once he keeps questioning her and pressing her for more information, he finds some rather unpleasant things. Basically, he did not, in fact, save her how he thought. So this kind of idealistic image that he has of his wife disappears and goes out of the way. So Dazai really thinks that he saved his wife from that geisha house undefiled, but I quote here, "I felt awful. It was as if my entire life had been smashed to bits." Dazai sets out to end his life, but actually ends up failing. And then there's another quote from here that I like, where he says, "But life, as it turns out, wasn't a drama. No one knows for sure what will happen in the second act." So after this kind of not so great start, Dazai, after having survived his attempt at ending his life, ends up surviving, but as fate would have it, has more in store for him. He ends up getting appendicitis, which he doesn't get treated for a while. So he ends up having to go to the hospital, and like a very serious health issue that arises from that. And the main problem is he ends up taking like pain medications. So he ends up getting addicted to the pain medications. And it gets so bad that at a certain point he starts to borrow money from as many people as he can just to sustain this addiction. And it really gets bad to the point where he's just like borrowing so much money from so many different people. So even already at these early stages, Dazai's life is not going great at all. And what we really end up seeing is that it gets much worse, as these things kind of do tend to spiral. So he's in this state, and then what ends up happening is eventually his friends and family kind of have an intervention and have him checked out into the hospital. And there's a quote here. Dazai says, "I was so crazed by my own suffering that I became blind to the obvious fact that other people, too, living for all they were worth." So in a sense, what Dazai is referring to here is there's a famous like quote and line from where it basically says, "Everybody has their own cross to bear." Dazai is starting to kind of realize that even though he was suffering and he was facing all these challenges, at least when he was there in that hospital, he has that like small moment of clarity and realization that other people too, other human beings too, also are suffering and having their own issues, their own crosses to bear. But of course, when you're in the throes of suffering subjectively as an individual, there's always the challenges that like you can't just take this reflective, higher level outlook and realize, yeah, other people are dealing with things too. Other people are also suffering. But Dazai does have that moment of clarity, at least in this case. So upon getting released from this mental hospital and institution, Dazai doesn't stay there too long, but he ends up getting better. Things are already pretty bleak, but at least he's recovered to some point from his addiction. So he does get out of the hospital. But again, it's like even here already, he's in a sorry state. And don't worry, it gets worse. But Dazai here refers to his life after the release from this hospital. And I think it's just worth quoting directly because it's just, I mean, the lines are brilliant in the way he describes the sorry state that he's in. Dazai says, "I returned to the apartment in Amuyama and lay my body down, all hope abandoned. I was already 29, so he's 29 at this point, and I had nothing. One doTERRA to wear. H's possession," that's how he refers to his wife in the story, H. "Two were limited to the clothes on her back. I imagined we'd more or less reached the bottom. We lived in insect-like silence." I mean, this line is just brilliant. Insect-like silence. "Completely dependent upon the money my brother sent each month. But we had yet, as it turned out, to hit bottom. In early spring of that year, a rather close friend of mine, a Western-style painter, came to me to discuss something that took me completely by surprise. Listening to what he had to say, I felt as if I were suffocating. H, his wife, had erred sadly." So in this quote, what Dazai is referring to here is he's writing one of his novels. I believe it's No Longer Human, actually, and he sends a piece of the text that he's writing to his close painter friend. And basically, the close painter friend interprets these lines that Dazai sent over as him having discovered that basically the adultery between like his wife and his painter friend. So the painter friend comes to Dazai's home and basically ends up confessing, thinking Dazai already knows about what's happened. And so that incident, and then Dazai here, I quote, in terms of when he's describing the situation, he says, "I had caused H," again H being his wife, "I caused H a lot of grief, but I'd always intended to stay with her till the day I died. Because I'm inept at expressing affection, however, neither H nor the painter had understood this. It was one thing to hear the painter out, but quite another to know what to do." So Dazai now ends up losing the one thing that he thought he could call his own and something that he could rely on. And he has something, he also says basically that when you think you've reached the depths, there's more room to go in terms of human suffering. And in this stage, basically things are getting even bleaker for Dazai. And I quote here, and this is in the sense of him discussing what happened. "I was the oldest of the three parties involved, and I wanted to remain calm and come up with the proper course of action for each of us. But in fact, I was overwhelmed by it all and completely lost my composure, so faltering and tearful as to invite scorn from both of them. I was incapable of action. As time went by, the painter gradually distanced himself from the situation." I want to draw attention to a specific word that Dazai uses here. He says contempt, which that's how his wife and his close friend who were like basically cheating on him, that's the word that he uses. And I want to point that this means disdain for someone or something. So I think it's fascinating that they have the audacity to kind of feel that way towards him even after being in the wrong themselves. And this reminds me of kind of the Dostoevsky quote, an idea that human beings are the forever ungrateful animal. But from this point, Dazai's life is already very bad, but him and his wife can't really reconcile with each other, and actually they set out to both die together. They go to I think like a lake house somewhere or some area in a more remote region in Japan, and they set out to die, but Dazai just basically makes sure his wife doesn't die, They end up attempting that, but end up both surviving, and then after they survive, they part ways. So Dazai's wife basically leaves and goes to I think like her countryside home from where she originally was from, and then Dazai, like, he goes and lives in this tiny format, very tiny dark room in like some boarding house, and at this point we can say that Dazai has really hit the rock bottom in his life. He's firmly in the abyss. He's firmly in the pit of Tartarus. The abyss is he's in the darkness. And I want to make a note here of a theme that runs across many of Dazai's works, which is fundamentally, in the core, at its truest sense, like, every human being is ultimately alone. And it's his loneliness here in this dark format, tiny room in the boarding house, in where we begin to see Dazai rising from the ashes. We really begin to see, after having sunk to the absolute lows, the bedrocks of despair, firmly in the darkness with no light, no dawn in sight, we begin, and as we know, it's darkest before dawn. Dazai, in the depths of his despair, begins to talk about a turning point, about a resurrection. And I quote here from him specifically, "I wonder what the turning point was," Dazai says. "What was it that made me decide I must go on living, that gave me the strength others take for granted? Perhaps it was my family's run of misfortune. Immediately after he'd been elected to the Diet, my eldest brother was indicted for election fraud. I've always been in awe of my brother's sternly principled character. Surely it was not he who'd acted improperly, but some evil person connected with him. Also, my elder sister died, my nephew died, a cousin died. I got wind of these things indirectly. I'd had no direct communication with anyone back home for some time. News of this unhappy sequence of events lifted me, little by little, from my prostration." And then I'll go on to quote here, Dazai talks about something else. He says, "The fact that as I lay in my room devoid even of the will to live, I was growing wondrously healthy and robust. This too must be mentioned as an important factor in the change that overcame me. One must also cite my age, the war, a reappraisal of history, loathing for my own dereliction, humility towards literature, the existence of God, and so on. But explanations of what turns one around always sound hollow somehow. However the close explanation may seem to fit the facts, there's always the hint, a gap, a fabrication somewhere." And now what I think is the climax and kernel of this short story, I think it's very important here. We're really seeing the turning point in the stages of Dazai's life. I quote Dazai, he says, "In the early summer of the 13th year, I began, for the first time in my life, to aspire to making a living with my pen. Rather late if you think about it. In my empty 4.5 mat room, I wrote for all I was worth. Even when there was rice left over in the boarding house pot that after dinner, I'd stealthily scoop it up and pat it into rice balls in case I got hungry, working late into the night." So really here we start to see the fruits of Dazai's labor begin to pay off. We start to see the turnaround at the very lows in that dark format room. Dazai's starting to make a comeback. And I quote here how he describes his comeback. "When everyone else ridiculed and despised me, that one writer alone quietly, consistently gave me his support. I had to repay him for the priceless trust he'd placed in me. In due course, I finished Old Folks. It was an honest account of the time H and I went to Minakami Hot Springs to die. I was about to sell it immediately. One of the editors I knew had not forgotten me and had been waiting for me to submit something. Rather than squander the money thus acquired, I redeemed my dress kimono from the pawn shop and set out on a journey." This is very important. We have to focus on this. "The mountains of Koshu. To affirm the change in my heart and mind, I intended to begin a long novel. I was in Koshu for 1 entire year. I didn't complete my novel, but I did manage to write and publish more than 10 stories. I heard voices of support from all sides. So I believe all of these descriptions that Dazai gives here of his resurrection and his turnaround were worth quoting in their full length, just because of the strength and the power of the words that are used here. But I do want to now draw your attention to kind of what exactly is going on here, and what are the lessons that I promised that we could learn, all of us, whenever we do hit a low point in our life, or we are at the depths like Dazai. Hopefully you're not there. The first one, as Dazai mentions, is there was external factors that were pulling him outside from his own self-absorption. Dazai was very much, and maybe rightfully so, in a state of me due to the suffering that he experienced, which is a very subjective and strong experience. But he ends up realizing that there's other suffering outside of his own private world of subjectivity, namely, in this case, the family that he had long cast aside. His brother is having issues that he'd always look up to. His sister and various other family members are dying. So Dazai is kind of brought out that other people are suffering too. There is an external world out there that is causing suffering. And specifically here, I've heard it said, I'm not sure, I'm by no means a psychiatrist or a psychologist, but I've heard it said that sometimes in, say, depressive or very sad states, there is an element of self-absorption. There is an element of it's me specifically, and maybe a movement away from that idea and mindset is actually beneficial and helpful in overcoming that kind of melancholy and depression or sadness. So that was one thing that he specifically mentioned. Of course, the second one, and if you watch some of my other videos, it's something that a theme that keeps recurring. I think it's fundamental, but Dazai in that format and dark room, there's no one to help him. It's just himself. So what does he have? The only thing he has is his own will and labor. And yes, it's labor. That's the thing. That's the thing that ends up pulling Dazai out of his work. So he ends up just completely focusing on his work because he has nothing else at this point, right? He's hit absolute rock bottom in the abyss by himself. So through his own labor, he starts to write, like just fervently writing well into the night. He describes how he gets rice. He becomes absorbed in his work. That's all he can think about. That's all he's doing. And this is what really, I would say, is the main element, this action, this labor. And he doesn't squander the money that he makes now from these like works that he's selling, but he's being aware and he's thinking forward towards the future. He's using the money to redeem his kimono so he can present himself out in public, so that he can kind of go out into the world. That's kind of it's a very simple thing, but it's a very early stage. So through his action, through his intense writing, Dazai now starts to make some money, and now he can start to slowly the seedlings and the saplings are beginning to grow, and now he can get out of his situation. And then the third one, third point that I'd like to draw besides the first two here is that, and this is there's a Nietzschean quote where Nietzsche says, one must have chaos within to give birth to a dancing star. So up until now, yes, Dazai's life has been tragic, both due to his own making, fairly, and also to external factors. But tragic nevertheless. And what he does is he uses that tragedy, he uses this suffering as fuel to give birth to a dancing star. And actually, one of the works that he specifically cites of selling old folks is that example of him going through that experience with his wife to go to the mountainside to kill themselves, right? Like subjectively, it's an impossible thing to even imagine and put yourself in that situation. But he's using the suffering and tragedy of that situation to give birth to a dancing star, a work of art, in this case, not a painting or a sculpture, but a literary work. And usually those tend to be the most brilliant and successful. And he says it sells out and he does well. And that kind of ends up helping him move him along in his course. So I do want to specifically focus on that even though tragedy in human life is inevitable, if it can be harnessed, that energy and that suffering, into something productive, into something creative, there is an outlet, there is a hope for further progress, for further movement, for an attempt to escape the situation. So after these 3 points we touched upon here, the fourth and final point that I think is very crucial that can be used as a template is after Dazai kind of gets himself off his feet, he sells a couple of short stories, gets some money, redeems his dress kimono so he can go out in public and in a social life and just be active and move out into the world. What does he do? He takes a journey, and the journey that he takes is he goes into this kind of like mountainside place to begin a more serious work. But he ventures outside of his format room. Now he can move out, go to a new place, begin his adventure and explore. And I do want to touch on something here. I'm not sure how you personally feel about him, but Jordan Peterson is something that he frequently talks about, is this kind of journey as a redemptive thing. And there is definitely that same element here in Dazai's work. So after he gets off the initial stages, this focus on the journey really begins to take hold. And I found that comparison very interesting. I'm not sure how you feel about Peterson. I feel like he's decisive. Some folks really like him, some really don't. I personally, for the most part, like his work. There's some stuff I don't agree with him, but in this particular case, this specific where he focuses on the journey, in his sense, usually he refers to it from a religious sense, but we do really see that same redemptive force taking hold here in Dazai's work, the journey. So, and in Peterson's language, when he goes, like when the character goes or the human being goes on that journey, either he succeeds or he fails and has an interesting story to tell, but also he has, at least he's in that journey, in that process and the difficulty, he's acquired the skills to sustain himself, even if that original goal was not achieved. But in Dazai's case, once he begins to focus and go there, and it's by no means easy, he ends up becoming very prolific and successful. He writes 10 short stories. They all sell and do well. While he's there, he ends up actually meeting his next wife, and in an arranged marriage, they end up getting married. And so Dazai's love life, his loneliness and solitude, that also ends up getting resolved. And it was because he went on that journey, he went on that exploratory path. So in this sense, the journey is in many senses redemptive and is something that needs to be considered once one has the base necessities to lift off, kind of like a rocket in the next stage. And that's the exact same path of redemption that we see here in Dazai's overcoming of his suffering. So Dazai ends up moving back to Tokyo with his wife. And at this stage, Dazai has a thing where he says he can finally refer to himself confidently as a writer. He always said that he was a writer before, but he didn't really write prolifically, and he didn't take it seriously. But after having gone through all this tragedy, all this suffering, this long and arduous path, all of that has built the confidence in Dazai to finally be able to proclaim and say that he is a writer. And yeah, I think, and that's about it for this video. I think if you want to follow the same path, I would definitely go back and rewatch the points that I made earlier in more detail specifically about the references are where first there's a move. If you're in this state of suffering and difficulty, move on to focus on other things outside the world that draw your attention, say other people's suffering, other events in the world, other problems, and realize that it's not human tragedy is not exclusive and set only for you. It's a feature of human experience and the human condition. So that realization of externality of tragedy, that it's out there too on other people. The second one, of course, being where we see that Dazai really begins to focus on labor. He begins to focus on action. So focus on action, focus on labor. See what you can do from your current situation, whether you're in some minor state of suffering or you're in Dazai's level, in the pit, in the abyss. But focus on action, focus on activity, focus on labor, because that is what you always have as a human being. Labor will never betray you. And then the third one, of course, is tragedy, and I will do more work on tragedy later in the Greek sense, because I love the Greek tragedians, and I think they teach some fascinating things. But tragedy in the human condition is inevitable. Tragedy is not something that we can escape. It'll hit us all in different various and forms. Everybody has their own cross to bear. but it's what you do with that suffering, what you do with that tragedy, what you do with that energy, that's really definitive of where the future you, the future stages of you will be. What does Dazai do? Well, he takes that energy and he channels it into creative outlets. In his case, literary, but in your case, it doesn't have to be literary. It could be your physique. It could be another form of art, painting, sculpture, literature, something else. It can be a sport, an activity. It can be almost anything. But that energy from tragedy and suffering needs to be channeled in a productive, higher goal, higher aim, and that's very important. And I think it's something that if you're in Dazai's situation in any various level of it, it will serve you well and guide you. And then finally, when Dazai starts to get a little bit lift off, the rocket starts to take off in terms of his growth and improvement. Once he gets some money and things start to very slowly start going, he ends up deciding that once his base necessities are met, he goes on this redemptive journey. And this can be different things for different people. It could be you leaving your city, your hometown. It could be you leaving even your neighborhood. It could be many things, but going on that journey and meeting new people and focusing on your work in a new place, for example, or going after those goals and aspirations that are somewhere else. Whatever that journey is for you in your specific particular case, to go on that journey, not to be afraid, because as I think Peterson has said, and then we see in the case here, in this particular case, in Dazai's situation, when you go on that journey, either you succeed or you have a great story to tell if you fail, but likelihood in that suffering, in that process of going on that journey, even if it doesn't work out the way you intended to, the skills and things that you will gain in that process will be more than enough to at least sustain you until you find the next goal or next journey that you want to go after, or maybe double down on the one that you're already on. But in very few cases, if you earnestly pursue that journey and that goal, will it betray you? The universe seems to work in very strange ways when it comes to that. So I think those 4 cases are about sum up the redemptive path. And we can see that Dazai was at absolute lows from all of the things that happened to him. I hope that this can give you hope and encouragement and show you that no matter what level of despair or suffering you are at, there's always something in the human condition, in activity, in the human program that you can use to move beyond your current situation. That there's basically always hope. And yeah, thank you for sticking with me throughout this video. I think it got quite long. It's been a while since I posted a video. I just got back from Japan, so I actually wrote the script for this video while I was reading Dazai's works in Japan. But I'm going to try to start posting more again. It's been a while. It's just because I was so busy coming back and everything I had to do and just life. But I'm going to go back to a regular cadence, or I'm going to try to. I have some very, very interesting stuff coming up for you. It's philosophical content, same as this, and then it's going to have some useful practical applications as well. Because I really do think that's one of the important things of reading the classics and the great works, is they have much to teach us in everyday practical life. It's not just pure abstraction. And yeah, so thank you for staying with me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Put your comments in the video below. I know many of you have mentioned that I need to work on my speaking ability, read less off the prompt. So I think I've been improving that. Let me know how that's going. I think eventually later on I might invest in some high quality equipment, both a microphone and camera. At this stage, I think it's fine. It's working well enough. But yeah, tell me your thoughts, your comments, your ideas. Yeah, and please like, comment, and share, and subscribe. Stick around because I have much more content coming in at a regular cadence. And I really appreciate your time, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you.